Good afternoon and good morning, everybody, and welcome to the WDI Good Work Advocacy webinar on COVID-19 and business and human rights. We're just going to give everybody a couple of minutes to log on and get ready, and we will speak to you shortly. Hi, everybody. My name is Anya Clark, and I'm the Senior Engagement Officer on the Workforce Disclosure Initiative. And welcome to a special edition webinar co-hosted by the Workforce Disclosure Initiative and Good Work Advocacy on COVID-19 and business and human rights. We are pleased to have you all join us today for what is sure to be a very lively discussion. We have a lot to cover, but we'll try to keep the conversation to about 50 minutes with 10 minutes for Q&A at the end. Please enter your questions in the chat box along with any technical comments on sound or audio, which we will get to as soon as possible. I am very pleased to be joined today by an esteemed panel of WDI and Good Work Advocacy allies and thought leaders in the space of business and human rights. Before I hand over to them for introductions, I want to first introduce the nature of the discussion today. Since late 2019, an outbreak of the viral disease COVID-19 or coronavirus, first identified in Wuhan, China, has spread across the globe, impacting millions of people. On the 11th of March 2020, the WHO declared the virus a global pandemic. While first and foremost a global health concern with an estimated mortality rate of 3%, COVID-19 has also been accompanied by severe economic turbulence, the likes of which has not been seen since the Great Depression. Unfortunately, neither has this been circumscribed to the economic realm. While analysts and news anchors alike forecast a deep global recession, ultimately, the crisis of the real economy has caused and will continue to cause additional human suffering. The Great Leveller, as the British government famously put it, is anything but. And in terms of workforce inequalities, insecurities and injustices, these have been rather expectedly exacerbated throughout the last few months. This, along with other more positive corporate and investors' responses, is what the panel today is here to discuss. But first, to introductions. Since transitioning to operational independence and diversifying its income stream earlier this year, the WDI has become a coalition of over 30 dedicated investor signatories. Our purpose is to increase corporate workforce transparency and accountability and drive up the quantity and quality of corporate workforce reporting. We do this through data collection, through an annual survey, and also engagement, convening companies and investors to speak candidly about salient workforce issues across their direct operations and supply chains. The WDI was created in 2017 with 34 companies disclosing to the initiative. Last year, 118 companies submitted workforce data through the WDI. Now I'm going to leave it up to my colleague Rachel to tell you a little bit more about workforce good work advocacy.
Hi, I'm Rachel and I'm the Research and Campaigns Officer on the Good Work Advocacy Programme at ShareAction. To date, this has mainly been centred around the campaign on the living wage in the UK. The Living Wage Coalition, of which some of you are a part of, consists of 30 investors with £2.4 trillion in assets under management. We have driven progress on the living wage within the FTSE 100 through sending letters and asking questions at companies' AGMs. 41 of the FTSE 100 are now accredited employers, up from only 2 when the coalition first started its engagement. To build on the success of this year we will also start engaging companies on their practices relating to the security of work, including engagement about the security of hours, employee status, and other workplace benefits, including sick pay. In the current pandemic, ensuring workers are provided with security is as important as ever. Today we will hear insights on company responses, workers' experiences, and investor engagement in relation to COVID-19 from our panel, who Anya will now introduce.
Thank you, Rachel. Now let me introduce the panel. And Kavya, maybe we can start with yourself.
Thanks so much, Anya. My name is Kavya Vagel, and I'm a Senior Manager for Wages and Workers Research at Just Capital. For those of you who may not know, Just Capital is a nonprofit organization that tracks, analyzes, and engages with large corporations and their investors on how they perform on the public's priorities. So our research begins with polling the American public, and we use the issues of importance to them as a foundation for all of our work. We then develop metrics by which to measure corporate behaviors and practices and collect data on companies in the Russell 1000, which helps us rank these 1,000 companies on how well they serve their stakeholders, which include workers, customers, communities, the environment, and shareholders. In concert with our rankings, we're also working to engage companies to push the needle on behavior change. Thanks very much for having me. I'm very excited to be participating in this panel.
Thanks, Kavya. If I go to Clara next.
Good afternoon and good morning to those across the Atlantic. I'm Clara Skrivankova. I currently work for Trust for London, which is an independent charitable foundation based in London. We provide grants to organisations that work on issues related to poverty and inequality in London. We usually distribute about 10 million in grants every year. We also engage in social investment and in policy work, and a range of our work focuses specifically on the issues related to working conditions. We have a specific program that focuses on better work, and we are pleased that ShareAction are one of our current grantees. Also, I have quite a strong background, and some of you might know me from previous times. Until I joined Trust for London about a year and so ago, I spent almost 20 years working in human rights and also in business and human rights and a responsible business practice.
Thank you, Clara. And Nina, if we go to you next.
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm Nina Roth. I'm an analyst in BMO Global Asset Management's Responsible Investment team. We are an investment manager and also engage and vote on behalf of a broader group of institutional investors on all things ESG. Among many other things, I coordinate our human and labor rights work and I'm actively engaging on living wage, workforce diversity, as well as social reporting and transparency. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Nina. And I'd just like to say on behalf of Share Action and the WDI that we are very grateful for having all of your time on the webinar today. So let's jump straight into the questions, if I may. And Kavya, maybe we should start with getting an overall picture and giving us a little bit more of an overview of Just Capital's research and the corporate responses that you've analysed so far to COVID-19.
Absolutely. Thank you, Anya. So in March of this year, Just Capital developed its COVID-19 corporate response tracker to begin examining how the 100 largest companies in the United States were supporting their workers, customers, and communities, and as an opportunity to showcase exceptional corporate leadership. As part of this tracker, we look at 17 different dimensions of actions. These actions range from implementing emergency paid sick leave programs for workers to shifting supply chain focus efforts to production, logistics, and distribution of COVID-related products, goods, and services. So using publicly available data that we find on company websites, press releases, investor relation pages, and reputable news sources, our team has been working to update over 60 data points on a daily basis. The data has been interesting. Among the 100 companies that we've tracked so far, we've found that about 42% have announced implementing some type of paid sick leave program in response to COVID-19 that would enable employees who may not otherwise be eligible to have access to paid sick leave, or ensure that employees don't have to exhaust their existing paid time off or sick leave benefits during the crisis. 64% have publicly asked employees in non-essential roles to work from home in order to slow the spread of COVID. We found that 64% have enacted special customer services, such as enhanced cleanings, curbside pickup, delivery, price cuts, payment deferrals, or protected shopping hours for high-risk individuals to ensure that customers and workers alike are able to maintain social distance and prioritize health and safety. We found that 33% have announced providing some type of financial assistance for employees, whether they're expanding eligibility for funds or employee grant programs, offering a one-time bonus, or providing hazard pay for employees who are on the front lines. Of the 45 companies who've announced store closures or service suspensions, only 24 have also announced continuing to pay employees during those closures or suspensions. So I hope that gives you a little bit of a flavor of the things that we're seeing and the trends in disclosure.
That's interesting. So you mentioned that your analysis is based on public findings, which obviously makes the need for corporate transparency very important. And as we know, there are multiple benefits to corporate workforce transparency, but many companies still continue to operate behind closed doors. And I mean, this is one of the major reasons for the existence of the Workforce Disclosure Initiative, more specifically. But how have you found corporate transparency throughout this period?
So companies have realized the need to be transparent about their actions in response to COVID-19. We've seen companies are creating dedicated microsites and news feeds, or even sharing internal memos and emails to workers with major press outlets to ensure that all stakeholders, workers, customers, and communities are informed. Transparency has been so important that we've been in touch with over 40 companies that we're tracking about changes to their policies and have sent guidelines and best practices to the full 100 in the tracker.
And is it too early to tell what good workforce practice looks like?
I think the tracker has actually allowed us to dive deeper into the research to identify companies on best practices. So yes, it's really interesting to see how some companies are even setting a gold standard. Let's maybe take paid sick leave, for instance. Home Depot has a standout policy. Not only have they provided part and full-time hourly workers with 40 to 80 additional hours of paid time off respectively, but they've also created a COVID emergency paid leave program that allows workers to take 14 days off if they're quarantined, and what seems to be unlimited paid time off for workers who have been diagnosed or have contracted COVID-19 until they've been approved to come back to work by a doctor. Full-time hourly workers over the age of 65, or those who are at higher risk for infection, also have an additional 160 hours or 20 days of paid sick leave under this policy. Some other dimensions that we measure are around financial well-being. So to compensate workers who are at risk during the COVID crisis because they're on the front lines, and to ensure workers that are able to maintain economic security during this time, we're seeing that some companies have instituted bonuses or wage increases. Lowe's, Walmart's, and Kroger's are examples of companies that are providing both bonuses, up to $300 in their cases, and wage increases, $2 per hour for frontline workers. One last example that I'd like to share as it relates to workers, though frankly through the tracker there's so many things that I'd be happy to share, is really around listening to workers' concerns during these times and understanding the holistic nature of the experiences during the COVID-19 crisis. So in addition to essential benefits that we see other leaders providing, Starbucks also launched a new mental health benefit that enables its employees to access 20 free sessions of counseling. To me, this really demonstrates that the lengths to which some companies are willing to go to ensure that their workers are able to stay holistically, and by that I mean physically, financially, and mentally well during the pandemic.
Yeah, that's really great to hear. The WDI survey also collects information on companies' well-being policies, in addition to operational health and safety data. But we find that, you know, I guess there's still quite a long way to go in terms of this kind of widespread adoption. Nina, maybe I could get your opinion as the Director of Responsible Investment at BMO and a WDI signatory and part of the Living Wage Coalition. You are constantly engaging with companies on workforce issues and the S of ESG. Do these policies and practices resonate with you?
Yes, absolutely, they do. And well, I want also to say thank you to Just Capital for the tracker, which is a very good resource. We also use, but of course we also dig deeper into the original responses from the companies and also have dialogues. So I think key for our engagement and for our work as the investor community is now that all these positive changes need to be made last. So currently, I mean, as part of really all of our engagements across all industries, we speak about the COVID-19 response of those companies. We have specifically approached the 10 companies that we cover as part of our Living Wage project, where we now try to understand how they reacted to our core expectations. I've listed some of them in the slide you see now. So one of the biggest gaps we see are around providing protective gear, which from our perspective is really the most important one, and at the same time actually also the easiest one to do. But it shows also clear gaps in occupational health and safety management and planning. We also see gaps in paid sick leave. While there are definitely a lot of positive examples, there are still companies who do not disclose anything about it, or not yet. And as I mentioned earlier, when we speak with them, we want them to commit to continue to provide paid sick leave once the crisis is over. And this is definitely a challenging aspect. Then in addition, and here that's probably the broadest gap, despite just having heard about the Starbucks positive example, mental health support, some do provide apps or access to online systems more generally, and have highlighted that in their ongoing communication, but have not installed dedicated measures right now. The least information we get on how they react supply chain wise, similar really in their public response, but also when we speak to them, most refer to their very good relationships with their suppliers and that they want to keep them. But then on the other hand, in the press, we see many different and very concerning developments, specifically in apparel and not sticking to existing contracts. The only good example so far, or standing out example, is probably Unilever. They have created a relief program of $500 million US to support their most vulnerable small and medium-sized suppliers with cash, and will also extend credit to selected small-scale retailers, which will probably help them to continue to be in business once everything picks up again.
Interesting. I think now is a good time to get Clara's input, because while there are many examples of companies responding to the pandemic responsibly, there's also no doubt that COVID has unearthed systemic workforce malpractices across every industry, as you suggested there in terms of supply chain management. Clara, can you give me a little more information about what's happening on the ground from your perspective?
Sure. Well, ever since the first indications occurred that there might be a reduction in business activity and the first talks of lockdown in early March here in the UK and in London, cases have begun to emerge of the impact of workers. The Trust coordinates the Employment Legal Advice Network, which is a network of over 40 organizations that work on employment and workers' rights in London. They include law centers, frontline advice and support organizations, groups that organize workers in the gig economy, as well as organizations that work on policy and advocacy. Members of this network have been bringing cases to our attention of low-paid workers, for example, have been dismissed from one day to another, facing destitution pretty much straight away because they have no financial buffer. We have also been hearing about cleaners that are too scared to go to work because they do not have protective equipment. We're hearing about delivery drivers, warehouse and retail workers who have been threatened with dismissals if they raise concern over health and safety of work, or were told that their hours have been reduced without any justification or any dialogue with them. We are also hearing about rogue employers that are furloughing workers and then demanding them to work, basically violating the government scheme, and also multiple employers failing to consult workers about what the options are that the government has created. Many workers that our members support working the gig economy, deliveries, warehouses, hospitality and cleaning, they are often low paid, already on insecure contracts. Many do not have guaranteed hours. Also, many cannot afford not to work, and any loss of work or even reduced hours can lead to destitution very quickly. Many will be migrants who will lack language skills, or even when they speak English, will lack the confidence or awareness about their rights to be able to negotiate with their employers. At the same time, I think it is also very important to highlight that we have heard that many employers do try to do the right thing, but may find it difficult to navigate the complex government guidance, or are facing cash flow difficulties because orders have been cancelled or payments are not honored. And I think that sort of goes very much to the points that Nina has just made, that small businesses that are at the bottom of the supply chains are dependent on business practice of their customers further up. And of course, their inability to continue to exist as a business will have a knock-on effect on the workers they employed. So in summary, really, the direct experience of the members of our network and others that we fund is that the current situation has thrown up many systemic issues that were existing before the epidemic. Issues like insecure and unclear employment status, the trap of the economy without safety nets, but also lack of enforcement around poor employment practice, and business models that are built around endless cost cutting and leave small businesses trying to do the right thing at a loss against poor purchasing practices further down the supply chain. The other thing that has really become clear is the lack of constructive industrial relations and worker dialogue, and sort of employers imposing new rules and make decisions without any discussion with their workforce. But what we have also found that where workers are consulted and situation is transparently presented and potential solutions are discussed, this can lead to less drastic measures, and even if there is a reduction, it is done in the best possible way and in a really managed and respectful way towards the workforce.
That's very interesting. And an additional question that I had is on the so-called key workers, like the delivery drivers, the warehouse staff, social care workers, that those are the workers of which we have come to rely on, but are renowned for being on the most insecure contracts. Do you think this has affected the general perception of how vital these workers are? And in turn, do you think this will precipitate a change in behavior of companies who employ those workers going forward?
That's a really interesting question. What's the role of the general perception of who is an essential worker? We know quite a lot about workers in the gig economy and other workers on insecure employment or on outsourced and subcontract contracts from the work that we fund across London. And I think you're right, the public perception has changed in the understanding of who is essential worker and key worker. The question I would have is the public perception sufficient to change the behavior of companies? In my experience, we need more than expectation that the change will occur voluntarily. What has been patent during the crisis is how many businesses actually went back on their commitments to ethical trade, cutting contracts, dropping suppliers, and shedding workers. But at the same time, true leaders are emerging, and we've heard from the previous contributions that there are companies that are repurposing production, but also we've heard about executives taking a pay cut to make sure that workers do not burn the brand, and some suppliers are being paid up front for future orders. What I believe the current situation has made even more apparent is that there is a need for a smart mix of measures, including mandatory due diligence legislation, which has already been proposed Europe-wide and globally well before the pandemic, but also new models to redesign our economies and set new standards to develop better mechanisms that are centered around people and planet. And I think that investors have a great opportunity to track how businesses have behaved in the current situation. And, the tracker that was demonstrated by Kaya is a fantastic example of that. But I think there is also an important element, and that's to draw on experience and input from civil society organizations on the ground more readily and regularly in assessing ESG performance, because it's those organizations that are in direct contact with the workers that can actually verify what is happening on the ground. And having worked in the responsible business space in the past, I think there is also a very important point to be made about indications of how serious business takes commitments to ethical practice, being seen throughout their operations, be it down the supply chains, but also the treatment of their staff in HQs here in London, and also the staff in outsourced functions, so security guards, cleaners, but also other indicators such as health and safety measures and the discussions around protective equipment and protective gear in the current circumstances. These are all very important indicators, and often the verification will come from the ground, will come from the workers, and I think that's where the reflection from the ground is very, very important to verify the other elements of the information that's being offered.
Interesting. Nina, on the investor point and the opportunity that they have there, maybe I can get you to respond to that. I mean, I know that BMO has been engaging with companies for a long time on the importance of social issues, but how can investors best engage with companies on protecting workers' rights and including mental health in the face of COVID-19?
Yeah, sure. And yes, indeed, we have been engaging on the social area for many, many years. But I'm going to frame my answer now from a broader social engagement perspective. We have recently launched a social practices expectation statement that basically outlines our expectations towards social performance of companies. And it's built on 3 main pillars: respecting human rights, upholding labor rights, and safeguarding public health. And it also outlines expectations from companies on everything social, so from responsible business conduct, which would include wages, which includes taxes, to wages, to protecting Indigenous people's rights. And on this slide, I've pulled out the general expectations from the statement that are particularly relevant now, and also where we see the most apparent right now. So as in the safe work environment, wages, the tax issue or tax transparency issue, stakeholder engagement, so getting everyone from your employees to the broader public, to investors on board with what you're doing. We do particularly ask right now, and we can jump to the next slide for that, for the provision of protective gear and for high frequency cleaning, so that workers who are exposed to contact with people are more protected. We ask for an introduction or an extension of paid sick leave provisions, especially, of course, in those jurisdictions where it's not the norm or not a mandated government policy. We also ask, and I like that it was highlighted earlier, for flexible shift work for those that are not working from home, and then also, or working remotely, or then also for more flexibility and adjustments in expectations for those working from home who are, for example, impacted by closures of school or childcare facilities, or needing to care for someone in their family. We also ask for emergency funds or salary guarantees for staff who are temporarily not required due to business closure or lockdown. So usually, like that would be manifested in a top-up of the furlough payment. And then, as highlighted earlier, we focus on the mental health support area when we engage. I mentioned this before and highlighted it here now again. I think protective gear is something that we have been particularly highlighting in conversations with companies, because that really can turn into a question of life and death. And so really think anything needs to be done and mobilized to speed up that process of procuring protective gear, or finding other ways of managing health security for employees. We've seen that with retailers who were challenged by getting masks in appropriate numbers to their staff, that they could then alternatively look into putting protective shields up, like plexiglass, something limiting access to production plants or shops to ensure social distancing and protecting the workers.
That's interesting. Let me shift focus for a minute. And up until now, we've been talking about the responsibility of companies to its workforce. But what about its more traditional responsibilities to its shareholders in this situation? In the midst of a global health crisis, when social distancing has been called for, the headline figure reads that 2/3 of FTSE 100 AGMs have gone behind closed doors. And this is something that ShareAction has been campaigning quite widely against, or has argued that this is a reduction in shareholders' rights. Would you be able to comment on this? What is your own opinion of this, Nina?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely agree. The impact on the AGM season is massive, and I mean, we are on the height of the season right now. Hundreds of meetings are being voted on every week now. So we've seen that, and we put that data through ISS, that last week we knew about around 1,200 meetings that were adjourned or cancelled. A third of them had allocated new dates. Around 612 meetings were now turned into virtual meetings. Really, historically, we have discouraged companies from holding online-only meetings, as from our perspective, this undermines the opportunity for interaction between shareholders and boards, where you can raise issues that are, as a shareholder, specifically relevant for you. But clearly, now it is necessary to hold them. So the virtual option is necessary. but we do encourage companies to ensure that there are still opportunities for shareholders to speak and to ask questions to the board. We've seen quite good examples, at least in the interaction with the broader community, not necessarily linked to the AGM directly, because sometimes they just shorten the AGM very much, but then allow investors or the broader public to ask questions to the board and senior executives. One of them was the Brazilian bank Bradesco. Also, China Railway Group had an investor day, which is basically the only opportunity pre-AGM to ask them questions. And also, there was a very engaging meeting and investor briefing with Shell, with inclusion of investor questions and also a lot of follow-up. Once, of course, this is all over, which we know isn't very soon, but still we will encourage companies to move back to a normal in-person AGM, but also maintaining the option to join in virtually. So basically do a hybrid AGM. This will allow to maximize access without extra financial or environmental or social costs that might be involved with traveling to those AGMs, but still allow the interaction between a company and its shareholders.
That's interesting. And then I guess from shareholders to stakeholders, Kavya, do you believe COVID-19 puts the model of stakeholder capital at risk? I know that's a big loaded question, but yeah, hopefully you can answer it from your own experience.
So I think I can say from the perspective of an organization working to be the measurement platform for stakeholder capitalism in corporate America, we created this tracker as a stress test of sorts for whether companies can meaningfully continue to serve all of their stakeholders in the wake of the crisis and even afterwards. So in that sense, COVID-19, in my mind, doesn't put the model of stakeholder capitalism at risk. It instead highlights even more than before that companies, workers, customers, and communities are the engine for achieving success, even amidst a crisis. As such, I really think it is critical for companies to mutually invest in them. The current form of capitalism has allowed for productivity and profits to rise, but has left workers behind, with low and mid-wage workers seeing stagnant wages. Between January 2017 and December 2019, for instance, the S&P 500 increased by 40%, while wages among production and non-supervisory workers increased by just 9% when not adjusted for inflation. But at the same time, these workers are now on the front lines of the pandemic. They're the workers who are traditionally not having access to wages or benefits that would enable family economic security. And now I think companies are really realizing that they have to fill these gaps in order to support these workers who sustain their business. The trends and examples that I had pointed to before promise a promising kind of like outlook for companies. I think we're seeing that some companies are indeed stepping up in big ways to serve their workers in a time of crisis. But at the same time, there's a question about whether the critical protections in the form of wage increases and benefits will persist for these workers beyond the crisis into a recession and even into the long term.
Yeah, Clara, I don't know whether you would have a conflicting answer to that or not. Clara, can I get you to jump in?
Yeah, sorry, I wasn't sure what happened because have we lost Kavya? I couldn't hear anything.
Oh. No, I think we still should have everybody.
Okay, it's just at some point there was complete silence, so I was trying to figure out what has happened. But yeah, okay, yeah, I can. So I'm afraid I haven't heard half of Kavya's contribution.
The question, yeah, the question is about whether it's kind of the COVID crisis puts the model of stakeholder capitalism at risk, and whether you do see a change in corporate practices during this time that might lead to some permanent policies.
Yeah, I think that it's interesting example to look at London in this context, because can you change the slide as well?
Yeah, sure, no problem.
Yeah, London is very interesting in this context because while it's a city where you've got loads of wealth and opportunities, it's also a place with significant levels of poverty. We've just released new statistics yesterday, new data that was produced in partnership with WDI-PI Economics and the UCL Consumer Data Center, which shows the picture of London before the pandemic. And what's significant to see that even before the pandemic, we have seen a huge rise in poverty in London in the last 5 years. So while you have a huge wealth, on one hand, 28% of Londoners are living in poverty, and many of them actually work. And what we have seen in the past 2 years under our Better Work program, where we have been funding over 40 projects that span from frontline intervention to legal challenges, what we have seen is that a lot of the work that is focusing on low-pay and precarious work is very much needed because workers in London do not have access to decent work as defined by International Labour Organization. And it shows us that the physical proximity to opportunities and well-paid jobs are not sufficient to lift many of the workers out of poverty. And all of the issues that we have already mentioned previously were in existence prior to the pandemic. But what we have seen in the past month is poor treatment of workers and wrong employment practices exposed en masse across a number of industries in London, which is something we have never seen before to have such massive exposure. And what we have seen is many of the underlying issues laid bare. And things like deregulation, poor enforcement, and lack of worker protection, and in particular, business models that see labor as a cost rather than an asset. And in normal times, a failure to pay decent wage and irregular hours make it already impossible many workers to afford decent living standards in a city where the cost of living is really high. And the current situation means for many that there will be even a further reduction or a loss of income, and also a very significant rise in hazardous conditions. So the challenge for us for the future is, what is the response and what is the potential for changing that, and there is good news in that there have already been a lot of discussions that we and others have been part of, thinking about the future of work, and there are some models that are available, and I think that's the question, and that's the challenge back to the business community and also to the investors who are able to encourage companies to adopt those models. And one of them I wanted to highlight, which was published just in January by one of our grantees, called .Everyone, which is focused on better work in the gig economy. And one of the things they propose in their report is to create a new governance structure for gig economy companies that would give workers greater voice in how the gig economy platforms are designed and organized.
That's very interesting, Clara. I might just put it back to Kavya now. Facing down a likely recession, why is it important for businesses to continually invest in their workforce?
So in the wake of a recession, there's an essential feedback loop that we have to consider. According to a new report from the McKinsey Global Institute, up to 1/3 of US jobs will be susceptible to furloughs and layoffs, or may be rendered as unproductive as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. 86% of those vulnerable jobs are held by low-wage workers who earn less than $40,000 a year. Other research that's been done by economist Christina Patterson agrees that young and low-income workers are the first to be laid off when a recession hits, but also typically have higher marginal propensities to consume. What's more, workers in highly exposed industries like food services, hotel and accommodations, and just general service industries are those in which workers are less able to do their jobs at home. All of this together means that when low-wage workers are furloughed or laid off, their consumption drops, businesses see lower demand, and companies may resort to even more layoffs, further deepening the recession. We would be remiss, or rather I would be remiss, if I didn't acknowledge the fact that women and people of color who are already facing the greatest wage inequities are also the most vulnerable to layoffs and high rates of unemployment, and also the ones who are most likely to be on the front lines right now. To avoid this feedback loop and protect workers who experience economic and social inequities, I really believe that it's critical for these large companies in Just Capital's tracker, and even otherwise, to continually invest in their workforce by ensuring that workers have access to wages and benefits now in response to COVID-19, through the impending recession and beyond.
Nina, I might get you to come in on this from an investor perspective, just to talk a little bit about why workforce issues are important to BMO. And I wonder if your ESG priorities have changed or taken a back seat even in the midst of kind of stock market turmoil and maybe other priorities.
Yeah, so I mean, from our perspective, workforce issues and employees are core to all businesses, and with that also to their success. So treating their employees well, just apart from being morally or ethically the right thing to do, it's also a business question. Just think about retention rates, training costs, injuries, legal costs, or just in general employee and customer satisfaction if you don't treat them well and they don't perform in a way that benefits the business. Looking at our own priorities over the year, you can find our thematic engagement projects for 2020 on the slide here. And originally, our engagement plan was extremely climate change focused, this being the most important year for climate change post-Paris. So this is clearly something that, just from an attention perspective, has probably taken a backseat, but still we continue to engage on all on non-COVID and all non-social issues. But as I mentioned before, all engagement interactions now include clear section on the company's COVID-19 response, be it in their own operations or in their supply chains. Overall attention to social issues in the investor community has clearly increased, but also the attention from senior management and investment managers that has increased along those lines as well. We've seen some individual dialogues for engagement that we had scheduled with senior management and the most senior executives. They rather have shifted to subject matter experts, as some of those senior executives were required to attend special COVID-19 response working groups or briefings and couldn't do our engagement, but still we do engage on the topics as planned.
Fantastic. I'll put the question to Clara in terms of the living wage as well, and why employees and why the living wage should be as important to companies as ever during this time.
Living wage is something that's very close to the heart of the trust, as we were one of the first funders to fund the living wage campaign by Citizens UK, and over 10 years ago now launched a special initiative that we ran until about 2013 that was very much focused on raising awareness about living wage as a way to tackle poverty, and that led to the creation of a body that would accredit employers and monitor compliance, which you will know now as the Living Wage Foundation. And it is interesting how living wage has emerged from being quite a marginal, contested concept to a well-known and accepted concept, not just in London and the UK, but globally. And as you know, Nina and others have mentioned, living wage has become a key measure and a key benchmark in assessing business performance. And while we recognize that many companies will be facing pressure during and after the pandemic, questions of accountability and poverty and the role of business have been raised quite significantly before the pandemic. And I think the data that I've showed you earlier shows that in-work poverty was an urgent issue even before. And I think what has the current situation exposed in city like London is challenges of in-work poverty and rising cost of living and widespread awareness of the low pay. The fact that workers, because they were on low pay, have absolutely no buffer very often, no financial buffer. So if the job disappears overnight, their livelihood disappears overnight. And this is a massive challenge for many in London, and many are now starting to question, you know, what has allowed this situation to happen. And I think as a part of our collective rebuilding of the economy and society post-pandemic, living wage and living hours, I think I want to stress as well, because living wage alone is not going to make it that much difference if there aren't living hours, so guaranteed minimum hours. These are models that are readily available to be built into systems. And what we know that after a decade of businesses signing up to the living wage, there is data to show that the business benefits, including better staff morale, productivity, and retention. So businesses that invest into their staff, even if they might need to furlough them temporarily, are likely to be better equipped to restart and rebuild when the situation comes to an end or where we move towards the exit phase. And in addition to that, the greater awareness, and I would go as far as to describe it in some areas, public anger at poor business practice against the backdrop of already stronger push for responsible business practice and corporate accountability, makes the case for living wage and living hours even stronger. And again, as I've said before, these are concepts and these are models that are readily available for businesses to adopt.
Excellent. Thank you, Clara. Nina, I might just hand over, because I'm conscious of the time, to give you the last word. And we touched upon the importance of corporate transparency both in normal times and during the current pandemic. But maybe if you could give your opinion on why it's important that companies keep, you know, reporting to the WDI and engaging with initiatives like the living wage and Just Capital during this time.
Sure. I mean, transparency is really key to our investment analysis, to make appropriate recommendations to fund managers, but clearly also to guide our engagement and voting, to have meaningful conversations with the companies we invest in or plan to invest in. So for that, we definitely need the data, we need better reporting. So currently the crisis is actually quite a good example for better communication, because as we are seeing in our own research and Just Capital raised as well, now companies do communicate much better, create new websites dedicated to their responses. So we actually see more and better communication on social issues than we have seen before. But clearly, I mean, there's still room for improvement, and we highlighted that as well. So paid sick leave is still something where we are missing information, and it is not featured as prominently as many other issues. But clearly, and I want to highlight and end on a positive note, we do applaud companies for reporting more. And we urge everyone to continue to reporting that way, becoming more detailed, and ideally also respond to the WDI survey.
Thanks, Nina. Additionally, I think transparency allows for greater peer-to-peer learning and discovering best practices and policies so that companies can enact them in-house, which raises standards across the board. And what all 4 organizations, I think, on this call today are hoping to achieve. So with that, and I know we have run slightly over time, we've got 5 minutes for Q&A, but if you did have a question and we are not able to answer it, please do write it in the chat anyway, and myself or Rosie will respond to it as soon as possible. I'll just hand over to Rosie to see if there are any questions on the line.
Sure, yeah, thanks, Anya. Just quickly to introduce myself, I'm the company engagement manager for the WDI, so coordinating the outreach to all the companies that we asked to take part in that project. I've been monitoring the questions, so thank you very much everyone for sending them through. Just in the interest of fairness, I'm going to just pick the first few that do them in the order that they've come through, so hopefully we'll get through at least a couple. The first one is just around major trends nationally. Have there been any differences between how European and US company practice has changed in the time of COVID? I don't know if any of the panelists want to jump in and have a look at that, but Nina, probably most applicable to you if you have anything you'd like to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, probably an immediate response would be that most of the European companies, at least for their continuous employees, already have paid sick leave provisions in place, given just the regulatory environment, whereas a lot of the companies in North America don't. And so here we see clearly developments on that side. In terms of protective gear, I think we see that retailers in Europe were quicker to react, but also you have to acknowledge that the virus hit Europe before it hit the US or North America. But on the other hand, you could say they then had less time to respond. So here, I would say, just from a purely looking at the retailers, the European ones did a better job than the US ones.
And I'll speak maybe a little bit to the PPE. In our tracker, we're seeing that only about 14% of companies have disclosed directly providing their workers with personal protective equipment. And I think that this kind of speaks to the lag in response on the US side as well.
Amazing, thank you. And then just hopefully very quickly, we've got time for one more, and this is specifically for Nina. It says, are BMO's social impacts and expectations something that other investors can sign on to? Is it more of a collaborative engagement or an in-house process? And with a note that says, great to see mental health and the treatment of suppliers is in there as well.
Super. It's more an internal policy. I mean, we applied to all our holdings as an expectation and to all future investment as an expectation. It can be seen as something like a human or labor rights policy. So it's more that than a collaborative effort. But clearly, everyone is very welcome to replicate that and apply it to their own holdings as well. And we would be very keen to learn about that. So if you do, please let me know.
Lovely, thanks, Nina. I'm just going to try and squeeze in one more then, and we've had a comment from an attendee who works for a not-for-profit law firm, and they've set up an online hub through which people can ask questions, and they've said that they've recently heard of a company that furloughed staff but wanted them to volunteer to return to work. So that's obviously totally against the government advice here in the UK. I don't know if there are any thoughts, and so the question as of that was how much kind of fraud can we expect through the platform, the relief that the government is offering? I don't know if Clara has any thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you. This is exactly the sort of examples that we have heard about as well. And while some companies are genuinely confused because the guidance keep coming from different direction and is in different places, we are also hearing about rogue employers trying to take advantage. And I think that's where sort of gathering the information and evidence from the ground becomes so important, because one thing is obviously to support the individual workers in confronting their employers, but there is a broader question over using the information from the ground to actually check the commitments and the public statements that companies are making. And that sort of goes to my earlier point that this sort of information is really important, because while some of the information might be anecdotal, a lot of organizations are collecting systematic evidence, and that evidence points to particular types of behaviors in particular industries related to particular types of workers or workers on particular types of contracts. And I think that's where the transparency about treatment of workers throughout operations, even where they are subcontracted, and sort of the monitoring further down your operations and supply chains becomes so important and indicative of the way that businesses are taking responsibility to the next level.
Perfect. Thank you, Clara. Anya, that's all that we have time for the questions. Right, hand back over to you.
Fantastic, Rosie. Thank you so much. And I just want to say thank you to all of our panelists and all of the attendees who listened in today. It really has been a great discussion. If you wanted to follow up again, like I said, with myself or Rosie or any of the panelists, please do drop us a line. And other than that, just have a great day. Stay safe, stay healthy, and yeah, join us for the next webinar. Thanks so much.